The night my in-laws handed me $10,000 in a white envelope, the rain sounded like something breaking apart overhead. Not a storm that roared, just a steady, punishing downpour that soaked everything slowly the way disappointment does. I remember noticing how the envelope was already damp around the edges by the time it reached my hands. Paper absorbs water quickly, so do illusions. I was 31 years old, married for just under 3 years, pregnant for 11 weeks and 3 days, or at least I had been until that morning. They didn't ask how I was feeling. No one did. They already knew the outcome before I arrived because my husband Daniel had told them. He always told them everything first. That should have been my warning sign long before that night. But when you grow up believing marriage means becoming part of something stable, you mistake control for structure. We were sitting in the formal living room of their house, the one no one actually lived in. Cream couches still wrapped in plastic underneath throw blankets. Framed photos of Daniel at different ages lined the mantel. His childhood trophies. His college graduation. Our wedding photo was there too, but cropped tightly, my shoulder cut off at the edge like an afterthought. His mother Lorraine folded her hands in her lap and spoke in the tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "We've discussed this as a family." I noticed she said family without looking at me. His father, Richard, stood by the window. He liked to stand when delivering decisions. It made him feel official, like a judge. The rain streaked down the glass behind him, blurring the outline of the garden they paid someone else to maintain. Daniel sat beside me, but not close enough to touch. His knee bounced once, then stopped. He stared at the carpet as if it held instructions he was afraid to read out loud. "You've been through a difficult experience," Lorraine continued. "But this changes things. We need stability. The family business needs continuity." I nodded once slowly. I had learned that nodding kept things from escalating. It was something I'd picked up over the years, a quiet habit that made people think they were being heard. Richard turned around. "A miscarriage is a sign," he said. "Not a punishment. A signal. This marriage was rushed." There it was. Not grief, not concern, an evaluation. I waited for Daniel to say something. Anything. Even a sentence that didn't fix the situation, but at least acknowledged I existed inside it. He didn't. Silence, I would later understand, was his most consistent loyalty. Lorraine reached for the envelope on the coffee table and slid it toward me. "This will help you get back on your feet. You don't need to worry about lawyers. We've already spoken to one. An uncontested divorce is best for everyone. $10,000. She said the amount the way someone might say a grocery total. I looked down at the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the money, but because of what it was meant to replace. My marriage, my child, my place. "What if I don't want a divorce?" I asked. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. It sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Richard's mouth tightened. "We're not debating this." Lorraine smiled thinly. "You're still young. You can start over." Start over. As if my life were a cluttered desk they were generously allowing me to clear. Daniel finally spoke. "It's for the best," he said quietly. "I don't want to fight them. Them, not us." That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically. There was no rush of anger or tears. Just a clean internal click, like a lock being turned. I realized then that everything I thought had been built on love was actually built on permission. Permission that could be revoked. I stood up. The envelope slipped from my lap and landed on the rug. No one moved to pick it up. "I'll need copies of whatever you filed," I said, "and I'll be staying somewhere else tonight." Lorraine looked relieved. Richard nodded once as if I'd passed a test by leaving without a scene. Daniel followed me to the door but stopped short of the porch. He didn't offer to drive me, didn't ask where I was going. The rain soaked through my coat in seconds. I walked to the end of the driveway before I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The cold air burned my lungs. I felt empty, but not weak. There's a difference, though it takes time to recognize it. That night, in a small hotel room that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, I laid the envelope on the bed and opened it. The bills were crisp, new, carefully counted. I laughed once. A short sound. Not because it was funny, but because it was precise. They thought this was enough. They thought this closed the account. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I replayed the last 3 years with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. The way Lorraine always corrected my wording at dinners. The way Richard insisted all financial decisions go through him. The way Daniel deferred again and again until I stopped asking. This wasn't about the miscarriage. That was just the excuse that made their decisions socially acceptable. By morning, the rain had stopped. I showered, dressed, and sat at the small desk by the window. I took out my phone and searched for a lawyer, not the one they had chosen, one of my own. I didn't call right away. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened my email and drafted a resignation letter from the company I had helped grow quietly from behind the scenes, the family business I had never been allowed to claim. I saved it, didn't send it yet. People think revenge begins with rage. It doesn't. It begins with information, with patience, with the decision to stop begging for a seat at a table that was never yours. As I placed the envelope back inside my bag, I understood something I hadn't the night before. They hadn't ended my life. They had underestimated it. And that I would learn was their most expensive mistake. I didn't send the resignation letter that morning. I closed my laptop and let it sit there unsent like a loaded thought. Walking away too quickly would have felt like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I checked out of the hotel, drove to my small apartment on the east side of the city, and unlocked a door that still smelled like my life before marriage. I had kept the lease. Lorraine used to tease me about it, said it showed a lack of commitment. A wife shouldn't keep one foot out the door, she'd said once over Thanksgiving dinner, passing the cranberry sauce without meeting my eyes. I had smiled, then apologized even. Now standing alone in that quiet apartment, I felt something close to gratitude. For once, my caution looked like foresight. The miscarriage paperwork sat in my bag, folded and unfolded so many times the edges were soft. I hadn't cried yet. Not because I didn't care, but because there hadn't been space. Grief requires permission, and I was still in survival mode. I made coffee, drank it black, and watched the street below come to life. People heading to work, a woman walking her dog, a man arguing on his phone, ordinary motion continuing indifferent to what had ended for me. By noon, my phone started to buzz. Daniel called twice. I didn't answer. Lorraine left a voicemail, her voice gentle but firm, reminding me that the lawyer would be sending documents soon, and that dragging things out would only make it harder. Richard didn't call. He never did when he believed a matter was settled. Instead, I called Mara. Mara had been my colleague before she became my friend, one of the few people at the company who spoke to me like an equal. She was a senior analyst, sharp, observant, and not impressed by last names. We met for lunch at a small Thai place near the office. When she saw my face, she didn't ask polite questions. She just said, "What happened?" and waited. I told her everything. Not dramatically. Just the facts delivered the way you might read a report. Miscarriage. Envelope. Divorce papers already in motion. She listened without interrupting, her expression tightening in places she probably didn't realize. "That's not generosity," she said finally. "That's a payoff." I nodded. "I know. What are you going to do?" It wasn't a question filled with pity. It was practical. I appreciated that. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I'm not disappearing quietly." She leaned back. "Good, because you shouldn't." After lunch, I went to the office. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it with new eyes. The building had always felt temporary to me, as if I were a guest allowed to decorate but not renovate. I had helped streamline operations, renegotiated vendor contracts, identified inefficiencies that saved the company millions over time. But my title remained vague. Advisor, support, the kind of role that disappears easily when it becomes inconvenient. As I walked past the reception desk, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked composed. No one would guess what had happened the night before. That invisibility had once felt like safety. Now it felt like camouflage. Daniel wasn't at his desk. Lorraine's assistant avoided my gaze. I went straight to my office and closed the door. For the first time, I pulled out the files I'd kept meticulously over the years. Not out of paranoia, I'd told myself, but habit. Emails, meeting notes, financial projections with my annotations, proposals that had been presented under Daniel's name, Richard's signature at the bottom. I wasn't angry as I reviewed them. I was focused. There's a difference between emotional pain and intellectual clarity. One clouds you, the other sharpens. By mid-afternoon, my lawyer called me back. Her name was Evelyn Grant. Her voice was calm, unhurried, like someone who had seen worse and survived it professionally. I explained the situation. She asked precise questions. Did I sign a prenuptial agreement? Had I received compensation beyond salary for my contributions to the company? Were there witnesses to my role in strategic decisions? Yes, I said to the last one. Emails, calendars, recorded meetings. Good, she replied. Then you're not starting from nothing. That sentence stayed with me. Not starting from nothing. It was the first time since the miscarriage that someone had framed my situation in terms of potential rather than loss. She advised me not to sign anything yet, to document all communication, to keep the envelope untouched. It tells a story, she said, and stories matter in court. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table and finally allowed myself to feel the absence. Not of Daniel, but of the child I'd imagined quietly, cautiously. I didn't cry. I placed my hand flat on the wood and breathed until the pressure in my chest eased. Grief doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits beside you waiting. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became clear. Daniel stopped calling. His lawyer sent documents. Lorraine sent messages framed as concern, but timed like pressure. We want what's best for you. This doesn't have to be adversarial. Think about moving on. I thought about moving on constantly, just not in the way they meant. At work, I continued as usual. I attended meetings, I contributed insights, I watched how often my ideas were repeated by someone else and credited differently. I noted how often decisions hinged on assumptions I knew were flawed. I didn't correct them, not yet. Mara noticed. You're quiet, she said one afternoon. I'm listening, I replied. One night, sorting through old files at home, I found a presentation from 2 years earlier. A proposal for expanding into a new market. One Richard had dismissed as too risky, the same market their competitors were now entering successfully. I smiled just slightly. It wasn't revenge yet. It was recognition, of leverage, of timing. I placed the presentation in a new folder labeled Simply Planning. By the end of that month, I had made my decision. I would leave the marriage, yes, but not the story they were trying to write for me. I would not be the woman who accepted an envelope and vanished into polite silence. I didn't know exactly how I would return, only that I would. And when I did, it would be on terms they could not rewrite. The first official document arrived on a Tuesday, just after 9 in the morning. The courier was polite, almost apologetic, as if he sensed that paper could bruise more deeply than fists. I signed, closed the door, and placed the envelope on the counter without opening it. I already knew what it contained. A timeline they had decided for me. A conclusion they assumed I would accept. I went to work anyway. There is a strange power in showing up when people expect you to retreat. The receptionist blinked when she saw me. A junior manager paused mid-sentence as I passed. Daniel was in a glass conference room with 2 board members, his back straight, his voice too loud. He looked confident in the way men often do when they believe history favors them. I didn't interrupt. I returned to my office and shut the door. Inside, the air felt different now, less borrowed. I opened my laptop and began organizing my files with intention rather than habit. Dates, contributions, decisions. I created a clear narrative not for court yet, but for myself. It's difficult to defend your worth if you haven't named it. At 11, Lorraine called. I let it ring out. She followed with a text. We need to talk. This isn't healthy. Healthy. The word irritated me more than any insult could have. It implied concern while dismissing agency. I forwarded the message to Evelyn without replying. At noon, Mara knocked lightly and stepped inside. They're moving faster than usual, she said. Human Resources asked about your exit timeline. I met her eyes. I haven't given one. She nodded. I didn't think you had. That afternoon, Evelyn and I spoke again. She had reviewed the initial divorce filing. They're asserting minimal marital assets, she said, and zero claim to intellectual or strategic contribution on your part. I expected that. Good, because we're going to challenge it. She explained the process calmly. Discovery. Depositions. The value of contemporaneous records. It all sounded clinical, almost dull, which was a relief. Emotion has no standing in legal rooms unless it's been translated into evidence. "Do you want revenge?" she asked at one point. "Or do you want leverage?" The question surprised me. "I want control," I said after a moment. Then we proceed carefully. That evening, I opened the courier envelope. The language was formal, distant. They framed the $10,000 as goodwill, a gesture of kindness. They framed the divorce as mutual. There was no mention of the miscarriage beyond a vague reference to irreconcilable differences. I signed nothing. Instead, I went through my personal records, bank statements, old emails, text threads I had ignored before because they felt insignificant. Patterns emerged. Requests from Lorraine disguised as suggestions, instructions passed through Daniel as compromises, financial decisions made without my knowledge then presented as facts. I printed everything. Over the next month, I lived two parallel lives, one visible, one intentional. Publicly, I was cooperative, calm, professional. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make accusations. Privately, I was assembling something solid, not anger, infrastructure. At work, the company announced a potential partnership, a mid-sized manufacturing firm looking for strategic investment. The board was enthusiastic, Daniel especially. He spoke about growth and synergy with the confidence of someone reading from notes he hadn't written. I recognized the firm immediately. I had researched them 2 years earlier. Their balance sheets were impressive on the surface. Their long-term liabilities were not. I had warned Richard then. He'd dismissed it as overly cautious analysis. Now they were moving forward without revisiting those concerns. I said nothing in the meeting. I took notes. Afterward, Mara followed me back to my office. "You could stop this," she said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, "I could. But you're not going to. Not yet." She studied me for a moment. "You've changed." I considered that. "No," I said. "I've clarified." One night, I dreamed of water. Not rain, but still water. A lake. I stood at the edge watching something sink slowly, deliberately. I woke up with the image clear in my mind. Some losses don't explode. They descend. In early spring, Daniel requested a meeting. Just the two of us. He chose a neutral location, a cafe near the office. He arrived early, sat stiffly, and ordered nothing. When I sat down, he looked at me like someone trying to recall a shared language. "This doesn't have to be hostile," he began. "I'm not being hostile," I replied. "You're making it complicated." I folded my hands on the table. "You made it unilateral." He frowned. "My parents are just trying to protect the family." "From what?" He hesitated. "Instability." I nodded. "Then you should understand why I'm protecting myself." He looked down. "You could take the money and move on." There it was again. The assumption that departure equaled erasure. "I could," I said, "but I won't." He exhaled sharply. "Why are you doing this?" I met his eyes. "Because I was there when the decisions were made. And I won't pretend I wasn't." We sat in silence. He looked tired, smaller. I felt no satisfaction in that, only distance. A week later, Evelyn called with news. "They've underestimated you," she said. "And they've made procedural mistakes." I smiled just slightly. "What kind?" "The kind that gives us options." By the end of that quarter, the partnership deal was set to move forward. Contracts drafted, announcements prepared. The board felt confident, too confident. I watched it all with patience, because I had learned something important in the months since that night in the rain. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets others rush ahead, convinced the ground beneath them is solid. And sometimes, when the moment is right, it simply steps aside and lets gravity do the rest. By the time summer edged into the city, the company felt like a house with new wiring hidden behind old walls. Everything looked the same from the outside, but the current had shifted. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Decisions were announced rather than discussed. I was still included technically, but the inclusion felt ceremonial, like an invitation sent out of obligation rather than desire. That was fine. Ceremony has its uses. The partnership announcement went public on a Friday afternoon. Press release. Carefully chosen quotes. Richard's name first, then Daniel's. I was mentioned once as part of a broader strategy team, a phrase vague enough to erase individual fingerprints. I read the release from my desk and closed the browser without comment. An hour later, Mara came in and shut the door behind her. "You saw it." "I did. They didn't disclose the contingent liabilities." "No," I said. "They didn't." She crossed her arms. "That's not an oversight. That's reckless." "It's optimism," I replied. "The kind that ignores inconvenient details." She leaned against the filing cabinet. "You're letting this happen." I looked at her, then really looked. She wasn't accusing me. She was worried. Not just for the company, but for me. "I'm letting them reveal themselves," I said. "There's a difference." She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded slowly as if filing the moment away for later. That weekend, I met Evelyn in her office. She had spread documents across the table, color-coded and annotated. I noticed how calm she was. Lawyers like her didn't rush. They waited until the facts had finished speaking. "They're pushing the deal through without proper disclosure," she said. "That helps us." "In what way?" "It establishes a pattern of exclusion, of misrepresentation, not illegal yet, but careless." I traced a finger along one of the pages. "Careless people don't think they need to be careful." "Exactly." She looked up at me. "Are you ready to make your next move?" I thought about the question, about timing, about how often women are told to strike early to assert to make noise. How rarely anyone advises patience as a strategy. "Yes," I said, but not loudly. The following Monday, I submitted my resignation. Not in anger, not with accusations. A clean letter. Grateful for the opportunity, citing personal reasons, offering a standard transition period. I sent it to Human Resources Daniel and the board. Within minutes, my phone rang. Daniel sounded stunned. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "Why now?" "Because it's time." He paused. "Is this because of the divorce?" I considered lying, then decided not to. "It's because of the clarity." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he said, "We need you. At least until the deal closes." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. "You made it clear I was never essential," I said. "I'm respecting that." Lorraine called next. Her tone was sharp, stripped of its practiced warmth. "This is irresponsible," she said. "You're putting people at risk." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm stepping away." "You're doing this to punish us." "No," I said calmly. "I'm doing this to protect myself." She scoffed. "From what?" I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, is most effective when it's earned. They offered incentives. A temporary raise, a title adjustment, a vague promise of future equity. I declined all of it. Not because I didn't want what they represented, but because I no longer wanted it from them. My last day was uneventful. A quiet exit. No farewell lunch. No speeches. I packed my things into 2 boxes and carried them out myself. As I reached the lobby, Mara hugged me briefly. "Be careful," she said. "I am," I replied. "That's the point." Outside, the air felt lighter, not free exactly, but honest. What they didn't know was that I wasn't leaving the field. I was changing position. Over the next few months, I disappeared from their immediate view. I took contract work under a consulting firm name that wasn't mine. I attended industry conferences without them. I listened. I observed. I built relationships quietly, intentionally. The manufacturing firm they partnered with began to struggle. Supply chain issues, regulatory delays, expenses that ballooned beyond projections, nothing dramatic, just erosion. I read about it all in trade publications, watched the company's stock dip slightly, listened to analysts hedge their language. Evelyn kept me informed on the legal front. The divorce proceedings moved slowly now. Their urgency had faded once they believed I was no longer a threat. They still offered settlements, slightly higher numbers, always framed as generosity. I declined each one. One afternoon, Evelyn called me with a question. "How do you feel about acquisitions?" I smiled to myself. "In what capacity?" "As a buyer." The idea had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks, but hearing it aloud made it real, tangible. "I feel interested," I said. She explained the mechanics, shell companies, investment groups, the importance of distance, how often people fail to recognize familiar hands when the names change. I thought about the envelope. The $10,000. How small it had seemed even then. Not because of the amount, but because of the assumption attached to it, that I would take it and go quietly. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window. The city glowed below, indifferent and constant. I felt no rush of triumph, only readiness, revenge. I was learning wasn't about spectacle. It was about positioning, about letting others believe the story they had written was complete while you drafted a different ending entirely. And I was just getting started. The first time I saw their company listed as a potential acquisition target, it was buried halfway down an industry newsletter, between a logistics merger and a quiet bankruptcy filing in the Midwest. No headlines, no urgency, Just a sentence, noting exploratory interest from outside investors. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and went for a walk. Momentum doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. By then, my life had settled into something spare and deliberate. I rented a smaller place closer to downtown, furnished it lightly, and kept my schedule flexible. Consulting paid well enough. More importantly, it paid cleanly. Every decision was mine. Every hour accounted for. Evelyn introduced me to an investment advisor named Thomas Hale. He was older, measured, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He didn't ask about my marriage. He asked about my thesis. "What do you see?" he said, hands folded, eyes steady. I told him the truth. About undervalued assets. About mismanaged risk. About leadership blinded by legacy rather than data. I didn't mention emotion. I didn't need to. He nodded. "And your distance from the company?" "Intentional," I said. "Good. Distance preserves clarity." Over the next weeks, we assembled a structure. Not flashy. Conservative on the surface. A private investment group with no obvious ties to me. Layered enough to discourage casual scrutiny. Transparent enough to withstand serious review. I was careful. Careful with names. Careful with communication. Careful not to move too fast. One afternoon, Mara called me unexpectedly. We hadn't spoken in months. "They're nervous," she said without preamble. "About what?" "Cash flow. The partnership isn't delivering. Vendors are pushing back. The board's restless." I thanked her and hung up. Information is most valuable when it's unsolicited. The divorce proceedings reached a turning point around the same time. Daniel's lawyer requested mediation. The tone had shifted. Less confidence, more compromise. They offered a settlement significantly higher than before, framed as a desire to resolve things amicably. Evelyn reviewed it and smiled. "They're worried." "About me." "About exposure," she corrected. I declined again. Not dramatically, just a quiet refusal. Each note tightened the pressure slightly. I could feel it even from a distance. In early fall, Thomas called me into his office. "We've been invited to submit a formal offer," he said. "Nothing binding yet, just interest." "For the company?" "Yes," I nodded. "Then we submit." The offer was reasonable, conservative, attractive enough to be taken seriously. It acknowledged the company's strengths without ignoring its weaknesses. It didn't insult them, it tempted them. They responded faster than expected. A counteroffer arrived within days. The numbers were higher than market reality justified. Pride was inflating the price. I recognized that impulse. I had lived inside it. We adjusted. Not upward, sideways. Added conditions, due diligence requirements, board restructuring. That last one gave them pause. I could imagine the conversations happening behind closed doors. Richard bristling, Daniel reassuring, Lorraine insisting on control. Control had always been their currency. In November, I attended a conference in Chicago, a panel on legacy businesses adapting to modern markets. Richard was one of the speakers. I sat in the back unnoticed. He spoke confidently, citing values, continuity, family leadership. Applause followed. I didn't clap. Afterward, in the lobby, I passed Daniel. He didn't recognize me at first. Then his eyes widened slightly. "You're here," he said. "So are you." He looked tired, older. "I didn't know you were still in the industry." "I never left," I replied. He hesitated. "There's talk of a buyout. You probably heard." I did. He studied my face. "It's complicated." "It usually is." We stood there surrounded by people moving quickly in different directions. For a moment, I wondered if he would say something real. An apology, a question. He didn't. "Well," he said finally, "take care. You too." That was it. No confrontation, no closure, just acknowledgement. By December, the offer advanced to formal negotiation. Lawyers spoke. Analysts reviewed. Auditors requested documents. The process was methodical and personal, exactly as I wanted it. Evelyn and I met one evening to review the latest developments. "They're starting to sense leverage slipping," she said. "But they don't know from where." I smiled faintly. They never looked behind them. The night before Christmas Eve, Lorraine sent me an email. Not through lawyers, directly. It was brief. "We didn't expect this year to end like this. I hope you're well." I read it once, then archived it. Some bridges don't need to be burned. They just need to be left behind. As the year closed, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Anticipation. The kind that comes when you've done the work, and now must wait for it to show itself. The company's future was no longer entirely in their hands, and soon, if timing held, it would be in mine. They had once offered me $10,000 to disappear. I was about to show them the cost of that assumption. The new year arrived without ceremony. No resolutions, no symbolic fresh starts, just a calendar turning over while negotiations continued beneath the surface, steady and relentless. By January, the acquisition process had entered a phase where optimism gave way to scrutiny. That was when people began to make mistakes. Thomas and I met weekly, sometimes in person, sometimes by phone. He never rushed me. He understood that this wasn't about closing fast, it was about closing clean. They're resistant to board changes, he told me one afternoon, especially the family seats. I expected that, I said. They believe blood equals insight. He smiled thinly. It often equals blind spots. During due diligence, we requested access to historical decision records, minutes from meetings, rationale for major shifts, internal communications around the partnership that had begun to unravel. Their legal team pushed back, claimed privilege, cited relevance. We persisted. Every delay worked in our favor. The longer the process stretched, the more the market speculated. Stock dipped further. Confidence eroded quietly like soil washing away under a foundation. Mara called again. Her voice was lower this time. They're cutting costs, she said. Layoffs are being discussed. I closed my eyes briefly. Are people being protected? Not evenly. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not guilt. Responsibility. I had known this was coming. Systems fail downward first. Thank you for telling me, I said. Be careful. I wasn't the villain of this story, but I wasn't pretending to be neutral either. Power shifts create casualties. The difference lies in whether you acknowledge them. Evelyn kept me grounded. Stay focused, she reminded me. Your leverage is strongest when it's invisible. One morning, she forwarded me an internal email chain obtained through discovery. Richard dismissing financial warnings. Daniel echoing him. Lorraine framing concerns as negativity. Reading it felt like watching a recording of something I'd lived in real time but never been allowed to name. They ignored you, Evelyn said. Yes, and now they're exposed. That afternoon, Thomas proposed a revision to our offer. We reduced the purchase price slightly, he said, but increased capital allocation for restructuring. Emphasize continuity for non-executive staff. I considered it. They'll see that as an insult. They'll see it as survival. We sent the revision. The response was immediate. A request for a meeting, in person, full board. They want to see who they're dealing with, Thomas said. I nodded, then it's time. We scheduled it for early February. Neutral location, downtown conference center. I didn't sleep much the night before. Not from nerves, but from memory. Of sitting on a cream couch with an envelope in my lap. Of being told my future had been decided. I dressed carefully. Not to impress. To be precise. Dark suit, simple lines. Nothing that announced ambition, everything that signaled competence. When I entered the room, conversation stalled. Recognition moved across faces in waves. Confusion. Calculation. Daniel froze. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. Richard's expression hardened. Thomas introduced me simply. This is one of our principal investors. No titles, no explanations. Richard recovered first. We weren't informed of your involvement. I wasn't required to be disclosed, I said calmly. Not at this stage. Lorraine leaned forward. This feels inappropriate. I met her gaze. This feels procedural. The meeting proceeded. Numbers, projections, conditions. I spoke when necessary, listened when not. I didn't reference the past. I didn't need to. It was present in every hesitation, every strained politeness. At one point, Daniel cleared his throat. You didn't mention your interest when we spoke. You didn't ask, I replied. Silence followed, not awkward, revealing. When the meeting ended, Richard stood abruptly. We need time. Of course, Thomas said. Take what you need. As they left, Lorraine paused. Was this your plan? She asked quietly. All along. I considered her question. No, I said. This was my response. Afterward, I sat alone in the room for a moment. My hands were steady, my breathing even. There was no rush of triumph, only alignment, of who I had become with what I was doing. Outside, winter light reflected off glass buildings. The city hummed. Weeks passed. Negotiations intensified. Their position weakened. Ours held. One evening, Evelyn called me at home. They've agreed to the board restructuring. I closed my eyes, all of it. Yes. And the purchase price. Adjusted. I exhaled slowly. This was the pivot, the point of no return. The final documents were scheduled for signing in March. I reviewed them carefully. Every clause, every implication. Control wasn't just about ownership, it was about governance, about who decides when things change. The night before signing, I took out the original envelope, the one with $10,000. It had remained unopened since that first night. I placed it on the table and looked at it for a long time. They had thought money could conclude me, that silence could contain me. They were wrong. Tomorrow I would sit across from them again. Not as family, not as a dismissed wife, but as the person who now held the pen. And I would sign. The signing room smelled faintly of polished wood and burnt coffee. A long table, neutral art on the walls, water glasses placed with care. Everything designed to suggest fairness, even when power had already shifted. They arrived together. Richard walked in first, shoulders squared, jaw set. Lorraine followed, composed but brittle, her smile practiced and thin. Daniel came last. He looked at me once, then away, as if eye contact might confirm something he still hoped was temporary. Thomas greeted them politely. Lawyers exchanged nods, brief handshakes, no warmth. I took my seat without ceremony. The documents lay stacked neatly in front of us. Hundreds of pages that reduced years of decisions, of assumptions of control into ink and clauses. This was the part people imagine as dramatic. It wasn't. It was quiet, deliberate, heavy in a different way. As signatures began, I noticed Richard's hand shake slightly, not from age, from effort. Lorraine signed last. She hesitated before placing pen to paper, her eyes scanning the page as if hoping to find an escape clause that hadn't been there before. She looked up at me. "You could have come to us." I met her gaze evenly. I did for years. She flinched, just once. Daniel signed without comment. When it was my turn, I didn't rush. I adjusted the page, read the final paragraph again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the moment fully. Then I signed. The sound of pen on paper was soft, final. That was it. No gavel, no applause, just a shift so complete it felt almost unreal. After the lawyers gathered the documents, Richard stood. "This isn't personal," he said stiffly. I looked at him. It never needed to be. They left shortly after. No conversation, no confrontation. Their loss had not been loud enough to require one. I stayed behind for a few minutes. Thomas placed a hand on the back of my chair. "You did well," he said. "I did what was necessary." He nodded. That's usually the same thing. The transition period began immediately. New policies, new reporting structures, transparent oversight. I attended meetings as chair not to dominate but to observe. Some executives were cautious, others relieved. Change unsettles those who benefit from ambiguity. Mara requested a meeting. When she walked into my office, she stopped short, taking in the space. "This is different." "It's functional," I said. "Sit." She smiled. I knew it. Knew what? That you weren't finished. I reviewed staffing decisions carefully. The layoffs had not yet happened. We restructured instead. Reduced redundancy. Redirected resources. Some roles changed. A few people left. Most stayed. I made a point of not inserting myself into daily operations unnecessarily. Control isn't about presence. It's about structure. Daniel resigned within the month. Quietly. No announcement. Lorraine withdrew from board activities. Richard stayed on as an advisor for a limited term, his authority now contained by policy rather than assumption. We met once more privately at his request. You didn't need to take everything he said. I folded my hands. I didn't. You took control. Yes. Why? I thought about it. About how to explain something that had taken me years to understand. Because you never believed I deserved it. He looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. The divorce finalized shortly after. Terms were revised, fair, balanced, not generous, not punitive, just accurate. When the papers arrived, I signed them at my desk and filed them away. No ceremony, no reflection. Some endings don't need witnesses. One evening, months later, I found myself alone in the boardroom after a long day. The city lights flickered outside. I thought about the night in the rain, the envelope, the way Lorraine had said start over. I hadn't started over, I had continued. Revenge stories often end with satisfaction. Mine ended with something quieter: ownership of my decisions, of my boundaries, of the space I occupied. They had tried to remove me with money and silence. I had answered with patience and precision. That is what they never taught me about power. It doesn't come from being invited. It comes from staying when you're expected to leave. And once you understand that no one can envelop you out of your own life again, power settles differently than I expected. It doesn't arrive with noise or celebration. It settles like weight, evenly distributed, asking to be carried responsibly. In the weeks after the acquisition, I learned that quickly. Every decision echoed. Every silence was interpreted. People watched not because they feared me, but because they wanted to understand what kind of order had replaced the old one. I was careful not to perform authority. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dominate rooms. I asked questions and waited for answers. I let processes do what personalities once had. That alone changed the atmosphere more than any speech could have. Still, not everyone adapted easily. There were executives who had thrived under Richard's unpredictability, who understood power as proximity rather than accountability. They struggled now. Meetings had agendas. Decisions required documentation. Favoritism no longer passed as instinct. One afternoon, the head of procurement asked to speak with me privately. He closed the door and sat stiffly, hands clasped too tightly. "I'm not sure where I stand," he said. I met his eyes. "That depends on your work." He nodded, uncertain. "Before it depended on relationships. Then this should be simpler." He didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Simplicity can be unsettling when you're used to navigating chaos. Outside the company, my life remained intentionally quiet. I didn't announce my role publicly. I didn't update social profiles. I let industry news do what it does best: spread selectively, incompletely. Visibility is a tool, not a requirement. The first real test came sooner than expected. An audit revealed discrepancies in a subsidiary's reporting. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to indicate long-standing habits of smoothing numbers to meet expectations. Under the old leadership, it would have been ignored. Under mine, it couldn't be. The room was tense as I reviewed the findings with the board. Richard was there, invited in his advisory capacity. He watched silently, his expression unreadable. "We correct it," I said simply, voluntarily, fully. One board member hesitated. "That could affect investor confidence." "So will discovery later," I replied. Richard finally spoke. "This isn't how we've done things." I turned to him. "That's why we're here." He said nothing after that. We issued a correction, transparent, uncomfortable, necessary. The market reacted mildly, then stabilized. Trust. I was learning grows faster than fear once it's allowed to. Not all consequences were external. One evening, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly at a grocery store. No lawyers, no conference rooms, just fluorescent lights and half-stocked shelves. He looked thinner, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. "Hi," he said. "Hi." We stood there awkwardly, two people who once shared a life now reduced to coincidence. "I heard things are different," he said. "They are," he nodded. "I'm consulting now, short-term projects." "That suits you," I said, and meant it neutrally. He hesitated. "Do you ever think about how it could have gone?" I considered the question. "I think about how it did go." He exhaled. "I should have said something that night." "Yes," I agreed. He winced slightly, then nodded. Accountability lands differently when it's not argued. "I hope you're well," he said. "I am." That was all. No bitterness, no reconciliation. Just closure shaped like honesty. Later that week, Lorraine sent me a letter. Handwritten. Brief. She wrote about disappointment, about family legacy, about feeling replaced by systems. She did not apologize. She did not accuse. She framed her loss as inevitable, the way people do when they no longer control the narrative. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't require response to be resolved. As spring approached, the company stabilized. Profits leveled, operations improved, employees adjusted. Slowly, a different culture took root. One built less on loyalty tests and more on clarity. Mara thrived. She was promoted to a role she had long deserved. When I told her, she laughed half in disbelief. "You know," she said, "they used to say you were too quiet." "I was listening," I replied. Outside the office, I allowed myself small indulgences. Long walks, dinners alone, silence without tension. I began sleeping through the night again. dreams returned gentler this time. One afternoon, while reviewing a routine report, I paused. The numbers were solid, the projections realistic, nothing dramatic, and yet I felt something loosen inside me. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. The revenge, if that's what it had been, was already complete. Not because they suffered, but because I no longer needed their acknowledgement. Their approval had once been currency. Now it was irrelevant. I thought back to the miscarriage, to the loss that had been treated as inconvenience. I allowed myself finally to sit with that grief without urgency, without anger, just recognition. Some losses shape you not by breaking you, but by revealing where you were never safe. That evening I stood by my window and watched the city shift from day to night. Lights flickered on, traffic slowed, life continued. I had not reclaimed what I lost. I had claimed what I had never been allowed to own in the first place. And that, I realized, was enough to move forward without looking back. There is a moment after upheaval when life becomes deceptively calm. The chaos fades, the structure holds, and people begin to assume the story has ended. That's when the quiet consequences surface, the ones no contract can fully contain. By summer, the company was stable enough that my presence became less necessary. That was intentional. Systems should not depend on a single person to function. I had learned that lesson by watching the opposite fail. With fewer operational demands, my attention turned inward in ways it hadn't before. Not toward regret, but toward evaluation of habits, of patterns, of the version of myself that had once believed endurance was the same as loyalty. One afternoon, Evelyn invited me to lunch. We met at a small restaurant near her office. No files, no legal language, just conversation. "You've done something rare," she said, stirring her tea. "You exited a family system without replacing it with another one." I considered that. I replaced it with structure. She smiled. Exactly. She asked about my plans, expansion, new investments, personal goals. I realized I didn't have immediate answers. That surprised me less than it once would have. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. Later that week, I received an invitation to speak on a panel about governance reform. I declined. Visibility still felt unnecessary. Power, I was learning, is quieter when it's secure. Not everyone agreed. An article appeared in a business magazine, framing the acquisition as a dramatic turnaround story. It mentioned internal conflicts and unexpected leadership shifts. My name appeared once near the end. No context, no history. I closed the article and moved on. The story didn't belong to them anymore. The first true reckoning came from an unexpected place. My mother called. We hadn't spoken much during the past year, not because of conflict, but because of distance that had been present long before my marriage. She had always believed in keeping peace by avoiding tension. I had inherited that instinct until I hadn't. "I've been reading about you," she said. Carefully, I replied. There was a pause. "You never told me how bad it was." I didn't know how to say it. She sighed. "I taught you to endure." "Yes," I said, "you did. Not accusation, just fact." "I thought that was strength," she said quietly. "It is," I replied, "until it isn't." We talked longer than we had in years. About boundaries, about silence, about the difference between sacrifice and erasure. When we hung up, I felt lighter, not absolved, just understood. At the company, the old guard continued to thin. A few more resignations, some retirements. Richard stepped down from his advisory role earlier than planned. He sent a brief note, formal, polite, closed. I didn't respond. Daniel's name came up once more indirectly. A recruiter asked for a reference. I gave one. Honest, balanced, limited. He had not been malicious. He had been weak. That distinction mattered to me. One evening, I attended a small dinner with Thomas and a few other investors. Conversation turned to legacy, to succession, to what remains after influence fades. "What do you want to be remembered for?" someone asked me. I didn't answer immediately. I thought of the miscarriage, of the envelope, of the rain. "I don't," I said finally. "I want to be effective." They laughed, assuming I was joking. I wasn't. Later, alone, I thought about the word revenge. How easily it's applied to stories like mine. How satisfying it is to imagine the tables turning, the powerful humbled. But revenge, I had learned, is a side effect, not a goal. The goal had been autonomy. In late August, I took a week off. No emails, no meetings. I went somewhere quiet, coastal, unremarkable. I walked, I slept, I allowed myself to exist without purpose for a few days. On the last morning, I woke before dawn and sat on the balcony listening to the ocean. I placed a hand over my abdomen, a habit that had never fully left me. I didn't feel sadness. I felt continuity. Life had not ended. It had redirected. When I returned, work resumed easily. Systems held. Decisions moved forward. I watched from a distance, intervening only when necessary. One afternoon, Mara stopped by my office. "You're different again," she said. I smiled. "How?" Quieter, but lighter. I nodded. "I'm not bracing anymore." She hesitated. "Do you ever worry they'll resent you?" I considered that. They already did. Resentment doesn't change outcomes. What changes outcomes is clarity, boundaries, the willingness to act without asking permission. That night, as I reviewed a routine report, I realized something simple and profound. The story no longer needed to be told from the wound. It could be told from the scar. And scars, unlike wounds, do not bleed when touched. By early fall, the story had settled into something people could categorize: a successful acquisition, a quiet leadership transition, a former family business absorbed into a more disciplined structure. When stories become easy to summarize, it usually means the most important work is happening elsewhere. For me, that work was internal. I had spent years responding to expectations that were never spoken out loud but always enforced. Be agreeable, be patient, be grateful. Those rules had followed me from childhood into marriage, from family into business. Breaking them had required more than action. It had required unlearning. The first sign that something had truly shifted came during a routine board meeting. A senior executive proposed an initiative that sounded promising on the surface, but relied heavily on assumptions rather than data. The old version of me would have softened my objection, wrapped it in reassurance, apologized for disagreeing. I didn't. "I don't support this," I said calmly. "Here's why." No preamble, no apology, just clarity. The room absorbed it. No one bristled. No one challenged my right to say it. The discussion adjusted accordingly. Afterward, I sat alone in my office and felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because I had asserted authority, but because I hadn't negotiated my presence in order to be heard. That evening, I attended a small dinner hosted by a nonprofit focused on women in leadership. I had almost declined. Visibility still felt unnecessary, but I went. At the table, stories circulated of careers delayed by caregiving, of promotions withheld for being difficult, of praise given conditionally, withdrawn easily. I listened more than I spoke. When it was my turn, I told my story simply, not the dramatic parts, the procedural ones. A woman across from me leaned in. "How did you know when to stop trying to fix it?" I thought about that. When I realized the problem wasn't misunderstanding, it was design. That answer stayed with me long after the dinner ended. A few days later, Lorraine appeared again indirectly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she was struggling. The transition had left her unmoored. Her identity had been intertwined with influence for so long that its absence felt like erasure. I felt no satisfaction in that, only distance. Empathy does not require reversal. At the company, preparations began for the annual review cycle, performance metrics, compensation adjustments, succession planning. I reviewed each carefully. Fairness is tedious work. It requires consistency, documentation, follow through. One name gave me pause. Daniel had applied for a contract role through a subsidiary. The request came across my desk because of the conflict of interest policy. It was allowed technically, but the decision was mine. I read his proposal. It was competent, conservative, safe. I declined it. Not out of spite, out of alignment. Some professional relationships end not because they're toxic, but because they belong to a version of you that no longer exists. I asked human resources to recommend other candidates and moved on. That night I slept deeply. No dreams, just rest. As the year edged toward its end, invitations began arriving. Holiday parties, industry events, dinners framed as celebration. I attended a few, politely, selectively. At one event, a woman approached me with a glass of wine and a knowing smile. "You know," she said, "people say what you did was ruthless." I smiled back. "People often confuse boundaries with cruelty." She laughed. "I wish I'd learned that sooner." So did I. On Thanksgiving, I spent the day alone by choice. I cooked for myself. Simple food. No rituals. No expectations. I wrote a list not of things I was grateful for, but of things I no longer tolerated. It was longer than I expected. Control disguised as care. Silence enforced as peace. Love conditioned on compliance. I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. A reminder, not a grievance. In December, the final dividend from the acquisition was distributed. The numbers were exactly as projected. No surprises, no hidden costs. That predictability felt like a luxury. Evelyn called to congratulate me. "You've closed every open loop," she said. "Not all of them," I replied. "What remains?" "The future," I said. "And that's intentional." She laughed softly. "You're going to be fine." I knew that. The revenge, if anyone insisted on calling it that, had completed its arc. Not with spectacle, not with humiliation, with displacement, of assumptions, of authority, of the idea that endurance is the highest virtue. What remained was choice. And choice, once reclaimed, changes everything that follows. The last year taught me that resolution doesn't always arrive with finality. Sometimes it arrives as permission. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop revisiting. Permission to let the past exist without granting it influence over the present. By winter, the company had entered a rhythm that no longer required my constant attention. Meetings were efficient. Reporting was clean. Disagreements happened without becoming personal. That was the culture I had wanted all along, though I hadn't known how to name it when I first sensed its absence. With space opening around me, something unexpected happened. I began to feel restless, not anxious, not dissatisfied, just aware that I had been operating in response mode for so long that stillness felt unfamiliar. I had built something solid. Now I had to decide what to build next. One evening, sorting through old files at home, I came across a small notebook I hadn't opened in years. It contained early career goals, half-formed ideas, notes about projects I once wanted to pursue before marriage, before compromise had become routine. I read them slowly. Some no longer fit. Others still pulsed with relevance. The next morning I called Thomas. "I want to start something new," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He simply said, "Tell me when you're ready." That trust mattered. At the same time, life outside of work began to assert itself in small ways. A neighbor I'd exchanged nods with for months invited me to dinner. A colleague asked me to mentor her quietly without formal programs or announcements. I said yes. During one mentoring session, the woman across from me asked, "How do you know when you're being controlled?" I didn't answer immediately. "When the cost of saying no feels higher than the cost of losing yourself," I said finally. She nodded, eyes wet, and thanked me. I hadn't intended to teach anything that day, but truth has a way of offering itself when space is made for it. Not all encounters were affirming. In January, nearly a year after the night in the rain, I received a message from Daniel. Short, direct. He wanted to talk. "Closure," he said. I considered it carefully. Closure is often a request for absolution disguised as conversation. I agreed to meet him. We chose a cafe far from familiar territory. He arrived early, I arrived on time. "You look well," he said. "So do you." He stirred his coffee, though it was already cold. "I've done a lot of thinking." "I'm sure." "I failed you," he said. The words landed softly practiced. "Yes," I replied. He looked up, startled. Perhaps he expected reassurance, understanding, the softening of truth. "I didn't protect you," he continued. "I didn't stand up to them." "No," I said again. Silence stretched between us. Not hostile, just clear. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I just wanted you to know I see it now." I considered him. The man I had once loved. The man who had chosen safety over solidarity. "I believe you," I said, "and I don't need to forgive you for that understanding to matter." He nodded, eyes shining slightly. "I'm glad you're doing well." "I am," I said and meant it without qualification. We parted without promises to stay in touch. Some connections are complete when honesty has been exchanged. That evening I felt no surge of emotion, no grief, no triumph, just a sense of alignment, of things landing where they belonged. A week later, Lorraine's name appeared one last time through a mutual acquaintance. She had moved, downsized, quietly exited the circles where she once presided. I felt a brief flicker of something like sorrow, not for her loss of power, but for how tightly she had held it, believing it was the same as worth. I let the feeling pass. By February, plans for my new venture began to take shape. Not large, not public. Focused on advising companies during transition, especially those built on family dynamics struggling to modernize. I understood those fault lines intimately now. Evelyn reviewed the structure. "This suits you," she said. It does, I agreed. On the anniversary of the miscarriage, I took the day off. Not to mourn, but to acknowledge. I walked. I sat in silence. I allowed the memory to exist without trying to extract meaning from it. Loss doesn't always need lessons. That night, I slept deeply, dreaming of nothing at all. The next morning, as I prepared for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Not the woman I had been a year ago. Not hardened, just clearer. I had learned that dignity isn't granted by others. It's enforced by boundaries. That love without agency is not love but management. That silence when chosen can be powerful, but silence imposed is erasure. And that reclaiming your life doesn't require permission from the people who benefited from you losing it. The story was nearing its end. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was mine again. And that was enough to move forward without hesitation. I used to think endings arrived with certainty. A final conversation, a last signature, a clear emotional release. I was wrong. Endings arrive quietly disguised as mornings that no longer require courage to face. By the time spring returned, a full year had passed since the night I stood in the rain holding an envelope that was meant to conclude me. The anniversary came and went without ceremony. I noticed it only because I no longer felt the need to mark it. That more than anything told me I had crossed something invisible but permanent. My new firm launched without announcement. No press, no branding campaign, just a small group of clients who found me through reputation rather than promotion. Family-owned companies, closely held businesses, organizations struggling under the weight of tradition disguised as loyalty. I listened to their stories carefully. A daughter sidelined after years of contribution. A spouse quietly excluded from decision-making. A founder unwilling to name succession because control had become identity. Different details, same patterns. I didn't promise revenge. I didn't sell empowerment. I offered clarity, structure, options. That was enough. One afternoon, after a long session with a client navigating an internal fracture, I walked home instead of taking a car. The air was mild. The city felt ordinary in the best way. As I passed a cafe window, I caught my reflection again. This time I didn't analyze it. I just kept walking. The past no longer needed review. I still thought about the child sometimes. Not with pain, with a quiet sense of acknowledgement. A life that had passed through me, briefly altering everything without ever being seen. I carried that truth without weight now. Some things shape us without staying. People occasionally asked if I regretted how things had unfolded. Regret implies an alternative I would choose now. I wouldn't. Because if I'm honest, the greatest loss I experienced wasn't the marriage or the pregnancy. It was the years I spent believing love required submission, that belonging meant shrinking, that peace was something you earned by staying quiet. Those beliefs cost more than $10,000 ever could. I saw Lorraine once more by chance from across a crowded street. She didn't see me. She looked smaller, not diminished, just unguarded in a way she never had been before. For a moment I wondered if she was finally learning who she was without control to lean on. I wished her no harm, I wished her no return. Some chapters are complete even if the characters remain alive. Daniel never contacted me again. I heard through distant channels that he had settled into a life that required fewer decisions, less resistance. Perhaps that suited him. I no longer needed to understand. What surprised me most in the end was how little anger remained. Revenge stories often promise catharsis through domination, through humiliation, through watching others fall. That wasn't what happened. What happened was quieter and far more lasting. I reclaimed authorship. I stopped asking for permission to be treated as an equal. I recognized manipulation the moment it arrived because it no longer felt familiar. And I learned that walking away isn't weakness when staying requires self-betrayal. On my desk now sits nothing symbolic. No envelope, no framed reminder. Just work that matters and space that belongs to me. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's not heroic, it's practical. Set boundaries before resentment sets them for you. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence. And when someone tries to decide your future without your consent, remember that you are not obligated to accept the version of yourself they prefer. Choosing yourself doesn't require noise. It requires resolve. If this story resonated with you, if you recognize pieces of your own life in it, you're not alone. These stories are more common than we're taught to admit. Feel free to share your thoughts, your experiences, or simply listen along as others do the same. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about justice without shouting and strength without spectacle, stay with me. Some endings are really beginnings, and some voices only find their power once they stop asking to be heard.